we have already seen the first of the large-scale agrarian empires, and we're now moving on to another one and more to come. As I've already noted, we know what agrarian or agricultural empire means, hopefully. So I don't have to go back and redefine terms, definitions here. But the gifts of the Nile, in quotations, ancient Egypt, this was a society that flourished largely because of the benefits brought by the Nile River, which were many. Now remember, almost all of these agricultural empires are centered around or located near fertile rivers and fertile river valleys, and this is no exception. But in this case, the Nile River was sort of even more important to the livelihoods and thriving of the ancient Egyptians. So the next stage of agrarian empire and a tremendous amount of stability in this particular empire for reasons that we'll see. A recent, fairly recent book on ancient Egypt, uh, mentioned or listed below, says the immediate impression of Egyptian civilization is of a coherent entity, the extraordinary duration of which has guaranteed it a special place in the history of humankind. The culture seems to have emerged already fully formed toward the middle of the 4th millennium BC, eventually vanishing at the end of the 4th century AD. For almost 40 centuries, Egypt possessed an air of unchanging stability and a political system that did not appear to be shaken by anything, even the occasional invasion. Uh, so one of the most outstanding features of all about this civilization and agrarian empire was its longevity. It lasted seemingly forever. Most empires don't last even close to that long. Is that the longest lasting ever? China is probably up there as well. I'm not sure how they exactly compare. We'll start with religion, since it was central to Egypt, as it was so many places in the ancient world, worldwide. We saw Mesopotamia was a very religious society, so no surprise here. But it is, I think, a point that needs to be made again and again, so we don't forget it. The Egyptians had multiple gods or believed in multiple gods, polytheism, the official word for that, and had a strong belief in an afterlife, way more so than the Mesopotamians. Now, since we've already just done a unit on Mesopotamia, and now we'll do a partial one on Egypt, we'll make some comparisons and some see some similarities and some contrasts between the two, which will help us to understand this and maybe Mesopotamia even more than we already do. Professor Perry, our beloved textbook author, says religion was omnipresent, meaning absolutely everywhere, in Egyptian life and accounted for the outstanding achievements of Egyptian civilization. Religious beliefs were the basis of Egyptian art, medicine, astronomy, literature, and government. This is a good example of something that came up in the introductory lecture. It's an important sort of way to understand history, an important element of understanding history, and that is unintended consequences. So we'll see the Egyptians' motivation for turning their attention to the stars and the planets was not scientific, but it led that in that direction nonetheless. Norman Cantor, one of the greatest scholars ever on the history of the Middle Ages, just passed away a few years ago, but it also wrote some about the ancient world in a very straightforward, simple book called Antiquity, which I'll be quoting for a number of units as long as we're in Antiquity. It's kind of my go-to book, one of the best authors, one of the greatest historians in American history, but also one of the best writers amongst them. His books are very readable. This one included. He says the multiplicity of temples gave rise to a priestly caste, which eventually became hereditary. Offerings to the gods, which comprised the revenue of the priests, enabled the temples to become a major political force in the state. So the priests became a political force in their own right, partially from the uh, take that they got from sacrifices, offerings to the gods, which are often, valuables of one sort or another, that then they were able to use to make themselves a political force. So religion is central. And as always, at the bottom of the screen, religion can be seen as social superglue. I like to use that kind of crude way of saying it because it sticks, pardon the pun. And so what does this mean? I said it in so many words about Mesopotamia as well, and we'll have reason to say it again and again as we go from place to place, civilization to civilization. And that is that, remember in our unit on prehistory, we talked about how difficult it is to get hundreds of thousands and then millions and then tens of millions and beyond people to kind of work together as a unit, since we can't know more than a handful of people at any one time. So you can't really trust them. You can't trust people personally that you've never met, but you can kind of if you're all kind of on the same page in terms of your beliefs. Remember, we talked about the importance of stories. If everybody believes kind of the same set of stories, more or less, then it's kind of like there's a trust there. We're all the same people because we believe and adhere to these set of stories, whether they're myths, whether they're something true. It doesn't matter as long as people rally around it. And I think history shows, various studies, many of them show that religion has sort of usually acted as the best way of binding people together, bringing unity to a society. So religion, of course, serves lots of other functions, including religious functions. But here, what I'm saying is that it had the maybe unintended consequence or intended, maybe both, of bringing this people or any people, but in this case the Egyptians, together through religious belief and religious practice. I can't stress this enough, the importance of understanding or thinking of religion as social superglue. Hydraulic despotism and the centrality of the Nile River in Egypt's agrarian empire. That's a mouthful. Hydraulic despotism is a phrase that a scholar years and years ago applied to these types of early civilizations. Hydraulic means sort of use of water. Despotism means sort of top-down hierarchical rule. So what's meant by this phrase is that the harnessing of the resources of the Nile for various purposes is what allowed huge amounts of power flowing from the pharaohs, the kings, on down, and also was the basis for their success, wealth, power, fame, fortune, all that stuff. Cantor again says the center of Egyptian life, the Nile, that is, geographically and in a broader cultural sense, it was this river. Toward the end of the 4th millennium BC, the Egyptians came down from the hills bordering the Nile to farm the fertile land along the river. Their dikes transformed, dike means dam, transformed the marshes along the river in fertile fields. Every summer, the Nile overflowed its banks, submerging the fields. When the river receded, moved backwards in the fall, it left a deposit of fertile silt carried down from the mountains, and crops were sown in the rich brown fields. Egyptian society and government were molded by the river and the desert. So again, as I said at the outset here today, more than the other civilizations that we've looked at, we'll look at, Egypt's success really is tied, extra specially, to the Nile River. In a really good book on sort of the power of different types of social systems, Michael Mann says, correspondingly, irrigation agriculture was decisive in generating civilization. Stratification, which means inequality, and the state in Egypt. No one has ever doubted it. Throughout ancient history, the Nile Trench supported the highest population density known to the world. One irrigation filled up the trench, productivity grew, so did civilization, stratification, and the state. The process was as in Mesopotamia, but squared. So the Nile, remember, the Nile overflowed, flooded regularly, but regularly is the key. consistently, so the Egyptians could kind of prepare for it, plan for it, because it would come basically at the same time in the same way, year after year. The Tigris and Euphrates, in Mesopotamia weren't so kind. They flooded a lot too, and surprised the Mesopotamians by sort of changing up, when the river was going to flood and overflow. So this no doubt helps explain how the Nile and the system created around it, the hydraulic despotism around it, is Mesopotamia squared, according to the author. It's just a gimmicky way to say it's a bigger, more powerful version, richer version of Mesopotamia. The Egyptian state, the power and stability of divine kingship, most of the time. So we're talking about a kingdom, a top-down, you see in the pyramid there, hierarchical system with the pharaoh at the top. And the pharaoh sort of called the shots. More so in the old kingdom than in sort of the later kingdoms, but throughout, with some peaks and valleys, the pharaohs were the mainstay of government. The power of the pharaoh, according to Perry, extended to all sectors of society. Peasants were drafted to serve in labor corps as miners or construction workers. Foreign trade was a state monopoly. The pharaoh authorized commercial ventures. In theory, all land belonged to the pharaoh. He oversaw an army of government officials who collected taxes, managed construction projects, checked the irrigation works, surveyed the land, kept records, and supervised government warehouses. So you see here in just that quote, already government is getting increasingly complex and complicated and sort of widespread. The power came down from the pharaoh, but already government in ancient Egypt is so big that the pharaoh has to delegate authority to certain officials, an army of government officials collecting taxes and doing other things, because the pharaoh can't do it all, at least in a hands-on way. Moving on, Professor Perry says all Egyptians were subservient to the pharaoh, and there was no conception of political liberty. So this hierarchical system, the stratified system, great inequality from top to bottom. So a few people are very powerful and rich, and the masses are poor and subservient, and don't have any freedoms, the kind that we take for granted today. The right to vote. There was no voting. It wasn't a democracy. These are hereditary kings or pharaohs, meaning they inherited it from the death of their father, and didn't have to lift a finger to get into that position. There are exceptions once in a while, but also that they didn't have rights like freedom of speech and things like this. So this is a pretty, as much as was possible with the technology of the time, organizational structures of the time, people didn't just have the right to do whatever they wanted, say whatever they wanted, but most of the time, because of the distances that had to be traveled from where the pharaoh had his palace to where you lived as a poor peasant farmer, your daily life was pretty much your own. Egyptian rulers, like their Mesopotamian counterparts, believed that they had an obligation to render justice. Injustice was seen as an offense against the gods. Most pharaohs took their responsibilities seriously and tried to govern as benevolent protectors of the people, as instructed by Egyptian wisdom literature. Keep in mind that while the Mesopotamian kings, like Sargon and others, were seen as, believed to be, ruling with the at the behest of the gods, that the gods chose them to be rulers. The Egyptian pharaohs do them one better, and that is the Egyptian kings here see themselves, and the people see them as gods themselves. So Mesopotamian kings were just seen as, okay, that's God's representative. God picked him to be our king. No. Here, this guy is a god. He's not the only god, but he is seen as a god. So this would make, since it was widely believed, this would make the pharaoh, more likely to be more powerful than any of his counterparts in Mesopotamia. I mean, if you get the people to believe you're a god and you're also the ruler of the country or the kingdom, that's pretty good for you. If you thought in my class you would never learn anything practical, I just proved you wrong. If your goal is to become the ruler or king of a small country, just remember this lesson. If you can get your people that sort of have to abide by your laws, to believe that you're a god as well, you're set. There'll never be a uprising against you, right? Because there's sort of double protection against it. One, it'd be breaking the law and treason, and two, it'd be sinning against the gods because you're rising up against a god. So I'm sure the pharaohs, at least most of them, most of the time, believed that they were actual gods. Wouldn't you want to believe that if people were telling you that your whole life? But nonetheless, whatever they believed, this was beneficial to them and beneficial to the stability of the system, since no one was likely to challenge it. Egyptians also derived a sense of security from the concept of divine kingship. What I just said, basically, it meant that earthly government and society were in harmony with the cosmos. The pharaoh was seen as governing in accordance with Ma'at, which means justice, law, right, and truth. Could anything be more reassuring than this belief that divine truth, right, from the gods, was represented in the person of the pharaoh himself, who guaranteed and defended the sacred order of the universe? So this you could see, I think, can see how even the poor peasant who's at the bottom of the pyramid or near the bottom, slaves are at the bottom, so slaves or farmers or artisans, all of them, living, not always easy lives, uh, especially the slaves, but would still feel like maybe the slaves not included. Slaves in Egypt, usually in Mesopotamia, in the ancient Mediterranean, as we'll see in Rome, Greece, were usually captives in war. So enemies captured in war, whoever they were, often were enslaved. Slaves probably couldn't say honestly what I'm about to say, but even the poorest sort of peasant farmer or struggling artisan probably took some solace and felt that the government that he was living under, with the pharaoh having all the power and not having any rights under this difficult system, was still a good system, one that you'd feel good that you lived under. Why? Because you had stability and law and order, and you kind of sort of knew where you fit in. So there was a certain sense of stability, safety, security in all of this. In the ancient world, we don't see. There's a little bit. There's exceptions, but we don't see overall any sort of belief in. We have to struggle against inequality because our human rights are being violated. Those are modern concepts, and so we make the mistake of presentism if we expect to look back and see farmers and artisans and slaves saying these rulers are unjust, they're oppressing us. Those are modern ways of thinking. So hardly anyone thought that way. If you lived in a system like this, where you were pretty much protected and had a place that so you knew what was expected of you, what your job was, etc., etc., you were likely to be, fairly, content. Egyptian values, again, everything was related to the gods, and the pharaoh as a god. The divine order was seen as eternal, and one of the goals was to sort of achieve harmony within that. So, seeing that that's a key value is another reason or way in which we can, I think, see that the average person, as poor as they may be, as difficult as life was taught through the culture, through the values, that sort of the idea is to sort of be in harmony with our divinely inspired order. So you don't want to be out of step and out of harmony. So if you rose up in rebellion because you were, an oppressed poor farmer, that would be, out of harmony. At least that was what the value system, the culture, the customs would, teach you from the time you grew up. The Egyptians looked to the past not the future. They believed in the wisdom of their ancestors. So they looked backwards and liked what they saw, and didn't believe that change, sort of in progress, were right. And that's primarily because those concepts didn't exist either. Those are modern concepts or semi-modern concepts that don't come till much later anywhere. So they weren't prone to thinking about change because it wasn't really likely, at least not change for the better or progress. Things didn't change much, they stayed the same. In fact, if they changed, there was usually likely to be some sort of disaster. So things either stay the same or they're disastrous. Okay, then we'll keep them the same. Well, how do we learn about how to do the same? Well, look back to what our ancestors did that was the same. Our parents, our grandparents, our forebears. How did they do things? What kind of wisdom, have they passed along forward to us? Which I actually think is something in our society which is very much based on progress and change, misses out on. I think we should be looking in both directions. I'm a historian, I'm a bit biased, but I do think the past, our own past, has things to teach us, both good and bad, and is a source and wellspring of wisdom that's there for the use. We just don't usually, partake of it. The Egyptians, and this is a place where we can contrast them with their Mesopotamian counterparts, had an optimistic outlook on life. And kind of for the same reasons that the Mesopotamians we know had a pessimistic outlook on life, which can be seen in things like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Remember that in Mesopotamia, the Professor Perry, our author, claims the two main reasons, the two main historical explanations that seem to fit anyway, to make sense of the Mesopotamians' pessimism. One, that they had a river system that flooded and very erratically, that caused all kinds of upheaval and death and destruction, uh, which isn't exactly a source for optimism, and that Mesopotamia as a region geographically was open to invasion, and in fact got invaded all the time, taken over by one group, then another and another, sometimes within their own region, taken by a king further up or down the Tigris or Euphrates River. But because they got invaded so much, and because their river systems caused lots of havoc, they seem to develop a pessimistic, worldview based on that. But how is this the same but different in Egypt? Well, we already know, at least in one instance, or one of these, the Nile overflowed and flooded, but regularly and consistently. So it didn't cause the same kind of havoc and nightmares. So this helps explain their more optimistic outlook on life. And also, unlike Mesopotamia, which was open to invasion because of the geographical layout, Egypt was very difficult to invade. Why? Well, because on the western and eastern sides, you have lots of deserts, which isn't easy to traverse and get an army across. To the north, you have the Mediterranean Sea. To the south, you have mountains. So, in a sense, Egypt was almost like an island. It did get invaded successfully once, as we'll see, but it wasn't open to invasion, that's for sure. It was actually more protected by the luck of geography than it was open to invasion. So optimistic outlook, partly because their river is consistent and doesn't give them the headaches that the Mesopotamians' rivers did, and they don't get invaded very much because they're luckily protected by geographical barriers to invasion. Ma'at, principle of truth, justice, order, was a big part of the value system as well. Even the way government officials were supposed to behave on their jobs, taught to be honest because honesty is efficient. So practical reasons for being honest. Scribes, sort of people who wrote documents, official government documents, etc., worked hard because they were believed to have sort of good lives. So again, sort of a practical part of the value system, which says truth, justice, and order are important, not just for this reason, but because it sort of brings about they bring about a better life for everybody. The political geography of ancient Egypt, we see Lower and Upper Egypt here. Wait a minute, aren't those out of order? keep in mind that it's almost like an optical illusion when you look at it, like one of those sort of trick, sort of puzzle things that you do, because we expect to see something upper, in a map like this, or in any kind of visual, to be above, and lower to be below, and yet that's reversed. So wait a minute, that doesn't look right. But remember, it's upper and lower Nile River, and the Nile flowed from the south to the north. The mountains are, when it says Kush, the kingdom as well, right south of that, you can see the Nile, its headwaters, up, high ground come there, and then it flows northward, right downward, and empties into the Mediterranean Sea, which you see at the top of the map. So upper in this case doesn't mean north of, it means upriver from Lower Egypt, which is downriver, hence the title. Also, the shape of the kingdom, like the political geography, is such that going down to about, around where it says Upper Egypt, a little bit lower, all the green shaded areas are sort of within the borders of this kingdom. When have you seen a kingdom, or today a country, shaped like that? Right? I mean, the Nile Delta in the north, that is a average looking kind of political boundary, but the rest of it is just river, right? Or at least a few miles on either side of the river. But of course, it's because, as I already told you, there's desert both to the west and the east. So you don't go too many miles out, and you're in deserts. You don't have fertile soil beyond the area that basically is sort of flooded by the very fertile soil of the Nile River. We'll talk about the three kingdoms, as they're known, the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, Old being longest ago, New being most recent, and some of the other kind of in-between periods here. And the in-between periods sort of then we see here known as the first, second, and third intermediate periods. And this represents, the labeling represents a fluctuation between centralization of power and decentralization of power. Meaning that in the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, the power of the pharaoh and his government was effectively centralized, meaning they had control over the whole kingdom. In the intermediate periods, they, to one degree or another, lost control, and power became decentralized, meaning that there were various kind of splinter regions of the kingdom that said, we're going our own way. They're kind of like they're declaring independence, and got away with it, at least for a time. So power would be in the hands of local and regional dukes, lords, noblemen, who are able to get out from under the control of the pharaohs for certain periods of time. So centralized power means when sort of everybody in sort of the region is under one government's rule, in this case the pharaoh's rule. And decentralized means when that to some degree breaks down, or greatly breaks down, and power is now sort of spread out in the hands of local leaders who are now ruling over a smaller chunk of the whole, or of Egypt in this case. Old, Middle, New Kingdoms can be sliced and diced into much more complicated fare. I'm just mentioning this, you don't need to know this, but actually there were 30 dynasties from through the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. So several or more dynasties in each kingdom, plus the intermediate periods. So Egyptian history, as you can see just from this, can get pretty complicated pretty quickly, with so much to have to kind of put into place. The first king or pharaoh, Narmer, sometimes referred to as Menes, seen as sort of as the founder of Egypt, is sort of steeped in myth. In fact, we're not even entirely sure it was a real person, or one person at that. But the writings that go farthest back mention this numerous times, and so Narmer is seen as the first emperor, I guess I could call him emperor, pharaoh of Egypt. There's no real evidence, as Norman Cantor says, of the existence of the legendary Menes, but whatever his name, he established his palace on the Nile at Memphis, not the one in Tennessee. This is the one in Egypt. It's a joke. Regarded by his countrymen not merely as a great political figure or a great warrior, but rather as a god whose rule over Egypt was part of the divine order of the universe. So we've already basically talked about sort of the connection between right the pharaoh and religious belief, and belief that the pharaoh was in fact a god. In legend of Memphite theology, meaning the theology coming from the capital at Memphis in the early days of the kingdom, the pharaoh is described as part of the creation of the world. And this myth was handed down for centuries thereafter. You see some of these stories. That's how we know about the stories carved into these kind of stone tablets. So the Old Kingdom we start with, going furthest back, from the beginning of unified Egypt, from Narmer on, in the dates, within the dates you see there. And the all-powerful Pharaoh was at sort of the height of his power actually earlier in the kingdom, as opposed to in the middle and new kingdoms. That's not to say in those later periods the Pharaoh, the king, wasn't still powerful, but this was kind of the heyday of his power. The power was spread out a little bit by the time you get to the middle and new kingdoms. But he was thought of to be the son of God, or I'm sorry, that's Jesus, the son of the sun. And you may already know that the Egyptian pharaoh was often associated with the sun. There were actually multiple sun gods in the Egyptians' pantheon of multiple gods, and the pharaoh associated himself with a number of them. So this was again an important sort of symbol, in a way, kind of a propaganda victory for the pharaoh to associate himself with something as powerful and mythical at the same time as the sun. The power of the pharaoh included what's known as authoritative utterance, at least in the Old Kingdom, which means if the pharaoh says it, it's law. He doesn't have to go through the process of even writing it out or having scribes or people debate and legislate and pass a law, get it rubber stamped here. No, he utters it, says it out loud, and it's law. That might have been more in theory than in practice, but the fact that that was sort of a thought or an ideal at all shows you something about the power of these leaders. His person was the embodiment of the world, divine order. We already know that. Michael Mann says all politics, all power, even all morality apparently resided with him, meaning the pharaoh. Why? Partly because of the unique geographical and ecological situation, making for limited options for political structures. A fancy way of saying the Nile, right, surrounded by desert, kind of left them limited options politically and ethically to some degree too, economically, etc. The Egyptian state, he goes on to say, was probably essential to the subsistence of the mass of its population.